Thank you, everybody, for joining us to hear how Carolina's healthcare system created an analytically optimized revenue cycle. Our presenters today are David Franklin, COO of Conance, and Conance works with over 500 hospitals to transform their financial performance. And we are also very pleased to have with us today Chris Kaiser, VP of Patient Financial Services, and Neil Wolotka, AVP of Patient Financial Services from Carolina's healthcare system.
As you see, Carolina's healthcare system, we're here in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's kind of our home base. But I will tell you, Carolina's healthcare system, we're the largest healthcare system in the Carolinas with multidisciplinary, but also 41 hospitals, and we have a lot of different relationships with those 41 hospitals. We have some that are wholly owned. We have some that are leased, some that are managed. We have a lot of different relationships with hospitals and how they can partner with Carolina's healthcare system. We have been a best hospital with U.S. News and World Report for urology and orthopedics. We've been the Consumer's Choice Preferred Hospital, with the National Research Corporation 10 times. All that said, it's basically a large system here in the Carolinas, $6.9 billion in net patient revenue, 7,900 licensed beds, 60,000 employees. So with that, then I'll turn it over to Neil, who's an Assistant Vice President in Patient Accounting, to talk to you about the system business office.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris was just alluding to, we have, this presentation will actually talk about the 7 facilities that we have here in the system business office in the metro area. Currently, the consolidated billing operation for these 7 facilities represents about an average of $17.3 million in revenue and $1.4 million in annual registrations. So account segmentation, we looked at it, and it has 3 major components that we felt. And working with Conance, we came together on that. First, we must apply our analytics, or the analytics, to divide accounts into groups. So for example, some accounts require a lot of attention to get paid. Some accounts need no attention, no calls, maybe just the first statement, and they'll pay. And some accounts, no matter what we do, they're never going to pay. So we needed to make sure that we had them grouped accordingly. So we analyzed 2 years of data to calibrate our vendor's secret sauce to the local demographics and payment patterns. This helped us determine our process for segmented accounts. So the next thing that we had to look at was customize the work routines based on the patient's expected propensity to pay. Grouping accounts requiring similar collection effort, such as similar cash value potential, similar payment behavior, or a couple of things that we looked at. Making sure that delivering appropriate work routines for each segment was also important, with the letters and the phone calls and the timing, what messages are on those letters. So we looked at all this to determine, this is how we need to have them set up. These are the groups that we need to have set up, or segments or schedules, however you want to word that. So we realized that scoring will enhance any business office operation if we focus on 30% of the accounts that will deliver 80% of the cash, and minimize the effort on the bottom 20% that yield less than 2%. So what account segmentation is not, it's not a credit scoring, so there's nothing that hits on the credit report, soft or hard, and it's not a delay for providing service. There's no EMTALA concerns at all. It's all done after the point of registration. So the results of the segmentation really were very good right from the outset. 70% of our collections were kept in-house, driving a material reduction in our contingency fees, which is obviously what we are trying to get to. This alone more than paid for the program, and was the reason we started down this path, and eventually why we've got all our facilities now on account segmentation. Surprisingly to us, our collections also increased by about 20%, to the tune of about $3 million a year incremental. These increases have come both from our internal efforts, excuse me, as well as those from our early out vendor. So it's a combination, but we did see a reduction in the fees from our early out vendor without losing overall cash. So that means we were collecting it internal. We attribute this optimizing of the resources during follow-up activity. Our SBO customer service handles the patients that will easily pay and that we want to make sure we build the right relationships with. Our early out partner is utilized for their skills in working with the harder collect accounts and patients who need more engagement to find the appropriate resolution. By using the right resources for the right accounts, we were able to not only drive costs down, but improve cash, but to also improve patient satisfaction. As you can see on this slide, the in-house collections increased by $529,000 a year since we started scoring. So this next piece is about the agency manager, vendor management component, which is called agency manager. So since segmentation has yielded such strong results and we gained trust and confidence through our partners with Conance, we now sought to extend our efforts into the accounts being worked externally by the collection vendors and our partners. The Conance platform has a module, which is Agency Manager, through which we are able to gain visible control over what is happening to the outsourced accounts. As we turn this module on, we immediately gain benefits of enhanced data capture. For instance, and I'll just highlight a few examples of that, we now are able to see the specific collection activity that our vendors are performing. Historically, this may have been captured in free-form notes that were put on the accounts from the vendor or even from our internal staff, and those aren't really analyzed very much. And Conance has provided a structured mechanism to understand what is happening if the black holes are being created and if work is being done in compliance with our own policies. Invoice auditing has been turned around to where we can now get an invoice internally from Conance to say this is what we should expect our vendor to charge us, so we can do a comparison. And I'll go a little bit more in depth in just a little bit on that. We also benefit from material efficiencies in how we communicate with our vendors. We no longer have to get fax or phone calls. Or for additional information or about deceased or bankruptcy accounts. We have work queues that we can work from that streamline the process, and that way we know that this is what's in your queue. You have to look at it versus getting the phone calls, and this is trackable information that's in the system. So, and it's all consistent from all of our vendors, where each vendor typically has their own process, or we try to get them to do what we want to do, but still this forces them to follow the same way. Finally, we have access to a broad suite of reports which allow for detailed insights into not only performance but also activity. We are now able to assess the full breadth of performance from financial to operational and compliance. One example of a report is the payment plan analysis that I'll share in an upcoming slide as well. Having this information at our fingertips certainly makes for good meetings and communication with our vendors. So the results speak for themselves. In just a few months, we implemented the platform. Our monthly collections with our vendors was up over 8%. The end of the year trend is seasonal, as you can see on this graph here, as well as related to continued insourcing we are doing as a result of segmentation initiative. In November, I finally gave in to have our flagship CMC start segmentation. And my only hesitation with that is now we're going to be insourcing a whole lot more accounts, and that means my customer service reps are going to get a whole lot more calls. And we're seeing that trend now actually started in January. So while the top line is good, I want to share with a few examples with you of the types of detailed information we now have visibility to with the Agency Manager platform. By no means these next few slides intended to be exhaustive, but a flavor of how we now have better insights to ask better questions and help the entirety of the collection process improve. And we can get any type of report out of agency managers that we need. We just got to ask them for it. So this slide here that you're seeing is an example of head-to-head performance chart. We have two secondary bad debt vendors, and the pairs of bars reflect performance from month of placement for our secondary bad debt vendors. The stacks of the bars represents how much they've collected in the month of placement and each subsequent to that. So what you see here is that vendor X dramatically outperforms vendor Y in all periods except for the first month, month A. As we dig into that, we see vendor Y had exceptional and not expected to be replicated performance in the month after placement. and that was due to a high one single payment. And in a bad debt world, secondary especially, that's going to reflect higher collections that really isn't the trend. So while we've been receiving reports from vendors previously, we had to compile the comparisons ourselves, and we were never confident that the vendors were reporting using a consistent methodology. Those concerns no longer exist at this point, now knowing that we can get the report straight from agency manager.
As you can see, this next slide speaks to something that I'm sure is near and dear to everyone on this call's thought process, our shifting regulatory situation. And so a couple things with this, as we're now shifting more to kind of the things we're doing on the front end from a presumptive charity looking at financial assistance type process. You know, we were fortunate here in North Carolina, and I use that term facetiously, to not only do we have to deal with 501R, and with the Affordable Care Act, we are a state that did not expand Medicaid. So in addition to all of that, the North Carolina legislature decided, well, we don't want to wait on those folks in Washington to come up with exactly what they're going to do. We're getting a lot of pressure about health care costs and this, that, and the other. So our North Carolina legislature actually passed some regulations that we had to adhere to starting October 1st of last year. So while 501R, we kind of have an idea, technically it's still in draft form, but now they're encouraging us to start adopting the draft. North Carolina went out ahead of that and put some requirements on us. So just a summary here. I know most of you are probably very familiar with 501R stuff. So now this next thing, you can kind of see on this next slide how our charity analytics work. And there's really a couple points of entry here. But basically now if the uninsured patient comes in at registration, we're getting that PARO score, then that's kind of driving from there what happens with those patients, which ones end up in eligibility and financial counseling. It also gives us an idea of folks we need to talk to about getting enrolled, you know, in these marketplaces or these exchanges while we're in open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act. Then for the things that's not the case, it goes on, and then through the EVI process and the segmentation of things Neil talked about, we actually then review again prior to anything going to bad debt. So if you're a self-pay patient, before you actually go out to bad debt, after everything else is said and done, we will either review that PARO score we already got, or we will send it again to get another PARO score to say, okay, if there's a real likelihood you live in poverty, but because of the way you kind of came in the system, some of this other stuff did not hit you, should that go to presumptive charity? So basically there's a double check for anybody in any circumstance going to bad debt if somehow they weren't caught in our upfront process. So this next slide on 28, basically, you know, this speaks to the community benefit. And this is huge. Like I said, we would much rather something go to charity if we're not going to get paid either way into community benefit than we would to bad debt. And as you can see here, what's really interesting, if you look at our qualification rates, you see how we started this in October of last year, and you see in kind of that December, January period, it spiked up. Well, what we actually did, and the Connets team was great about this, is we were looking by facility at the amounts being approved, and based on kind of our historic trends and things and the percentages we were seeing from an inpatient basis with the patients we talked to, we felt like we needed to widen the net a little bit. So they worked with us through calibration to help us actually widen the net, and that caught some more folks that were being qualified, because our financial assistance policies go up to 400% of federal poverty guidelines. However, our presumptive process, we started at around 200% federal poverty. And when I say that, that's the calibration of how they've scored PARO and worked it out with our local market. And we felt like that we were maybe cutting some patients off that really should get the financial assistance, so we widened that net. Now, on this next slide, where it talks about the analytically optimized revenue cycle, I'm just going to touch on this for a second, and then I'll turn it over to David to see what he has to add. But basically, you can see what's really neat about the suite of products we're using here is it's the total revenue cycle front to back. This is really the first time we've ever taken any type of, you know, financial billing, maybe that's the wrong term, but any type of system that would be used in patient accounting and put it on the front end this far forward in the revenue cycle. And we are seeing tremendous benefits from that in terms of, you know, we know which, and the increased cash is because, you know, we're going to see which patients are going to end up potentially being presumptive charity versus which patients we really need to be collecting on. And we've even put into place a minimum copay in the ED, but to try to discourage frequent flyers that utilize the ED inappropriately. Neil talked about the reduced cost to collect and all of that. And at the end of the day, it's about patient engagement. We don't want to scare patients off in a market where they can choose their healthcare provider because of what would be considered aggressive collection tactics or aggressive front-end tactics if they're not needed. Now, we do want to make sure people pay because we have to pay the bills. But at the same time, we want to treat patients first. That's our slogan around here, patients first always. So this tool is really helping us do that. So I think that's kind of our perspective, David, and I'll let you pick it up from there.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. And appreciate you sharing your experience and telling that story. And I think that gives a really good basis for everyone to understand what's happened. I think the other piece that's embedded and kind of underlying this whole story, and Chris was just talking about it, is really the ability to take all this information about your patients and harness the power of the longitudinal records and understand what they've done with your system over time. Apply an analytic layer on top of that to really assess who they are and make decisions about how you want to engage them and what you're trying to accomplish. So if you're trying to grant them charity, if you're trying to help them towards the right payment plan, if you're trying to keep them in your system and satisfy them through the billing and collection process, how we leverage that information across the totality of our revenue cycle front to back really becomes a powerful tool for us if we start to think expansively about that data set and the information we can leverage from that. With that, I'll just spend a minute on the page you see here, which really starts to say, I think what the folks at Carolina's Healthcare have done is tremendous in terms of their ability to leverage data, leverage analytics to make real changes across their revenue cycle for great impact both for themselves, their employees, and most importantly, their patients. But I think it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of how you start to think about and how we continue to think about predictive analytics across the revenue cycle. And I think it's really important as everyone on this call thinks about the world of analytics. I tend to think about the world of analytics in two flavors. There tends to be a whole set of information which is classically, I think, referred to as business intelligence or BI, right? Which tends to be historic, tends to be trending reports, and basically says where you've been. I refer to that as descriptive analytics, and it's certainly helpful and it's certainly informative. What I think that the power, though, is when you start thinking about predictive analytics, which are about how do I make decisions about what I'm going to do in the future and how do I change my outcomes. And I think that's really the power of the story we've just heard, which is taking information about the patients, making smarter decisions about how to engage them through a collection process, through a charity process, through a collection system, and really optimizing the totality of that intervention in that network. And I think there are a number of examples on this page that you can see here, which you can start to continue to push the envelope in terms of how we're going to apply analytics to continue to benefit patients and improve our operations, certainly as the revenue cycle continues to undergo dramatic change